I want to talk about 3 lies that Christians tell ourselves. I've been thinking about this for a little while, and I think each of these is something that I've taken for granted throughout a lot of my life. And as I grew up in a Christian family, a lot of this stuff you kind of are socialized to think. And I think when we pull each one apart, each of these 3 things sort of doesn't really hold up. So let's talk about 3 lies that Christians tell ourselves. The first lie we tell ourselves is that Christian experience is unique, that essentially Christians have something that nobody else has. And when I was in a fundamentalist evangelical world, this manifested in a specific sort of Christian exceptionalism. We would often say that we didn't have a religion, we had a relationship with Jesus. And there are different forms of this in different Christian denominations, different Christian sects. But basically, the way this works out is you end up pretending that your group experiences something that no other human experiences, that your group has some sort of exceptional, unique relationship to the divine, to your tradition, to your holy book. And this is something that every other group essentially does wrong. And it's really interesting because I think what ends up happening in this is that the fundamental sort of way that Christianity manifests isn't really any different than any other religion. Like we have ideologies, we have a sacred book, we have rituals we practice, we have a lot of things that you see in other religions. But in order for Christians to convince ourselves that what we're doing is better and more unique and more special than other human beings, or convince ourselves that God loves us more, we end up creating this sort of gradation. We end up sort of playing these language games to try to basically convey that we are unique, that our experience is unique. So again, like the tradition I grew up in, this isn't true of every Christian tradition, but in evangelicalism broadly, we really don't use the word religion. And it's funny because the word religion is kind of artificial anyways. I come from a religious studies background. We talk a lot in religious studies about how the word religion is largely made up by Protestantism. The word religion was often made up and used to ascribe meaning onto human behavior. Protestants very much invented the study of religion. And if you go around the world, a lot of the people in the places that we were practicing religions never thought, oh, I'm practicing a religion. It's something that was often kind of imposed from the outside. But there's kind of an irony here because now what happens in many Christian congregations is we will actually say, well, we're not even religion. So not only do you create a category and stick everybody else in it, that everybody else is religious, you then turn around and look at your own behavior and the things that you do in your own group, and you try to elevate that and say, this is more than religion. In our case, this was always the thing in evangelical fundamentalism. It's a relationship with Jesus. It's real. It's something unique. And we never stopped to realize that fundamentally, everything we did was the same thing every other human did. Like we had ideas about meaning, we had ways we formed community, and we talked to God. And not every religion thinks that they can talk to a deity, but it is out there. There certainly are many other religions that have forms of the things that Christianity has, the idea of revelation, the idea of appointed people to lead, the idea like God's will for you, whatever. That's very common in Abrahamic religions generally. So the thing that we would often deny ourselves was the acceptance that we are just doing something uniquely human. And I think that's something that actually cheapens the Christian experience. I think it's something that cheapens when the only value in what you're doing is to believe that you're doing something that nobody else can do because you have a religion that demands exceptionalism. I think it's really pathetic. I would actually rather follow a religion that recognizes this is one of among many human traditions, and I'm doing something that is human. That the way that I experience this is cultured, the way that I believe this is true, the way that I walk through this life in this religious community is not perfect. It's something that a lot of humans do, but in my own way, I am following this human tradition. If we can do that, if we can kind of flatten that, instead of elevating Christianity to this status of something else, it actually might give us some humility to recognize that we are just trying to figure it out the same way everybody else is. That's one lie. The second lie that I think Christians often tell themselves is that they can make sense of the world because of a metaphysical behind it. And I often see this. I'm not a philosopher, so I'm going to try and stumble through this. But what I see, for example, in Christian discussions of morality, I often see something like, well, you can't have morality without a metaphysical foundation. So we kind of posit that whatever morality looks like here on earth, it's patterned on a divine morality given by God. And I see this in apologetics, and it's often used to kind of elevate Christianity into cheapen or look down on, say, atheists, for example, to say, well, you can't have morality without a God. The irony is that metaphysical is just a faith proposition. And there could be a metaphysical, there could be a God. Our morality could be modeled on a divine morality, but that's not an argument. That's a faith proposition. It's something you believe. And I think it's ironic that we use these things sometimes as a starting point for like presuppositional apologetics, for example. We use these beliefs as foundational and judge other people for not having them. And I think it's really kind of sad. And I think, for example, if we look at morality, what we actually have is morality. Morality is a social reality. And we all, like, as social beings, morality evolves and it changes, but like every human civilization, this is what C.S. Lewis famously says in his work Mere Christianity, and it kind of feeds into natural law theory, that human civilizations do have morality. That's like starts as a reality. You can try to say that that's based on a metaphysical foundation, but that in itself doesn't make your argument superior. Metaphysical is always a belief proposition. You can believe that if you want. Like, that's all stuff that's been worked out by philosophers and theologians, and like, but none of that is based on anything observable or real. So like, what we start with is reality, and we work up to the metaphysical. What we always start with is what would be called the the phenomenological, and work up to the numinous, if you wanted to use those philosophical terms. So Christians often lie to themselves that they have a superior way of life, a superior way of looking at the world, a superior philosophy, theology, whatever, because they start with the metaphysical. But the metaphysical is always posited. That's as far as I'm going to go in philosophy, because I'm not great with philosophy. Moving on. Number 3. The third lie that Christians tell themselves is that foundations are revealed as opposed to constructed. There's a really famous sociologist, Peter Berger, and he's done kind of 2 different versions of this theory that I really like. It's called the Berger-Luckman model of like social construction, I guess. Basically what both of these models do is give us a way to explain how humans create the world, how we create our world around us. This is good, like sociological stuff. So essentially the argument is that humans, we create things, and then we go through a process called alienation, which we forget that we ever created them, and then we just take those things as like the real. So for example, we could say like capitalism, for example, is like something that we all just take for granted, but it was created by humans. It came out of the brains of humans, came out of human practice, and now we all just take it for granted as this real thing that's separated from us, it's alienated from us. And I think the religion is the same thing. When I look at the foundations of the Christian religion, often people aren't really willing to actually ask real questions about the foundations. They sort of just have already gone through this process with Christianity, assuming that it's just like from outside. And this, we have a big word for this in Christianity, we call this revelation. So often we will use a word like revelation to talk about the Bible, for example. My problem with this as a historian is that if you actually look at the foundations of where the Bible came from, like if you actually look at the evolution of the Bible, church controversies that grew it, its adaptation, how the canon evolved, all this sort of thing is 2-3 century processes. It was formed, it was created by different whims of the church, and different doctrines that emerged, and different things were edited and adapted. The Bible was this process, and I think what happens is a lot of modern Christians forget that. And it's kind of funny because what ends up happening is we ascribe something miraculous to a human process just because we don't see the process. Essentially, we now call this revelation because people actually don't pay any attention to the process of where it came from. The process created something. That something, in this case, we're using the Bible. The Bible acts on people. We could say the Bible is interpreted. People read the Bible as a holy book. We forget that it ever came from us. We forget it essentially goes through this process of alienation. It gets higher and higher, especially with Protestantism. The Bible becomes more and more sacred. Now, 20th century, 21st century, a lot of people call the Bible inerrant, essentially because we have just forgotten where it comes from. And I think it's really funny thinking about Christian origins, because I see this back and forth. I see often when people want to justify the trustworthiness, for example, or the historicity of the Bible, they will quote church fathers. But then ironically, when people want to justify church fathers, they will quote the Bible. So there's this circular relationship between the tradition that the Bible and church fathers are actually just like, they're just emerging side by side. And that's just literally the records we have of the emergence of Christianity. But when we look at these things, when I look at these as a historian, it's not magical, it's not miraculous, it's not even pretty. There's a lot of people who were good, honest Christian people who got the crap kicked out of them by theological controversies because they had the wrong belief about the metaphysical, about the Trinity. They got pushed out, they got excommunicated, all of these things. It's not even a pretty process. When I think about something like this idea of alienation, that essentially humans create things and then forget that we ever created them, and in the case of Christians often ascribe those things to God because we forget that they came from humans. We think that therefore they must be from God. Anyway, it's weird to stop and realize that. It's weird to think that these things don't have the origins that Christians often think they do, but that Christians have forgotten that things like the Trinity, the Bible, different church doctrines, etc., were actually very much human inventions. So that's my attempt. I was just kind of playing around with ideas, but I was thinking about 3 lies that Christians tell themselves. So just to go over one more time, the 3 lies are: 1, that Christian experience is unique, that Christianity is something like unique that other religions don't experience. 2, that we have some sort of moral or intellectual superiority because we have a metaphysical behind our tradition. Remember, we actually just start from reality and posit a metaphysical, which you can do, but it doesn't give us moral superiority. That's just faith. It's just religion. And number 3, the lie that things that are very clearly constructed out of history, out of ideology, out of church struggles, whatever, the lie that those things are actually given by God and are revelation. I love this tradition. I love being in Christianity. And I think if we are going to nurture a really intelligent, honest Christian tradition, doing away with these 3 lies that we tell ourselves would go a long way. I hope that was interesting to you. Let me know what you think. I'll see you next time.